Hey folks, a few words on Aristotle. He is certainly up there with Plato as one of the most important founding figures of the Western political tradition. His key works that we are not reading are the Politics and the Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. These books here, Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son, which I always found a bit endearing. Plato is sort of exciting and wild and utopian and sort of sets the stage for what can we imagine is possible in politics and society. And Aristotle, he's a bit drier. He's a bit more conservative. That makes him less interesting to read to me these days. And yet I don't want to downplay either the historical or the theoretical importance of Aristotle's work. They're both ancient Greek philosophers coming out of a similar tradition, concerned with things like the good life, as opposed to things like liberty and freedom, which are our modern concerns. And so they share a lot in common, right? It's understandable. Aristotle was Plato's student, but they also have some pretty important distinctions that we should highlight. And the first here is that maybe the most important is that Aristotle just doesn't believe in Plato's project of abstract rationality, the thing that's laid out in the cave. This idea that we're going to get away from the world and in some sort of up in the air pure realm of thought figure out the way in which we are supposed to live our lives. Aristotle just doesn't think that that knowledge, that the way we learn, epistemology, that it works that way. He follows an epistemology that is much more empirical, right? It's very familiar to us in terms of modern empiricism. It's somewhat similar, right, to what we have come to know as the scientific method of hypothesis and observation and hypothesis testing. Um, Plato, Aristotle was famously, the big scientist of his day, and for much of history up until um, the Enlightenment period, um, science in terms of astrology, in terms of our understanding of the natural world and categories of natural life. All of this came out of works of Aristotle's. He thought you could observe the natural world and figure out how it works and how it should work, how it ideally works or works as well as possible, and that could be done by embedding yourself, by engrossing yourself in observation and participation with the world, not simply removing yourself and thinking about it abstractly, as Plato thought. Right, knowledge is embedded, and it's embedded in these things we call practices, which are can be traditions and institutions and ways of doing things that, particularly in terms of social knowledge, right? Knowledge of the ways of society and politics and things like that. That these practices, they have standards, they have norms that are developed over time, and they're passed on through participation, through experience, and through conditioning, not simply through book learning, right? Which Aristotle is not against book learning, but he doesn't think you can sit with your math textbook and just imagine things and figure out the world and shape yourself. He thinks you have to actually study with and do and participate. So, for instance, Plato kept his rulers from participating for most of their lives in military campaigns because he didn't want that experience to bias them. But Aristotle would say, the only way you're going to learn how to be a military leader is to serve under military leaders and to observe and absorb their knowledge, and then maybe, right, if we philosophize and discuss and debate about what came before us, once we've mastered it, we can improve upon it, right? So this idea here that you should learn from the masters of any particular practice, be it politics or be it, say, a sport, before, or chess, right? Learn from the chess master before you develop new strategies and ways of playing chess. Would be a very Aristotelian way of approaching learning, and you can think about impressionists, right? I think this is a good lesson here, right? Everybody loves Monet and Van Gogh and such, and these were not people who painted in non-realistic ways because they couldn't. These are people who had mastered realistic forms that were in vogue and expanded beyond them into new and exciting ways of using light and color and form, but only once they sort of had mastered the traditions of painting that came before them. It's a very Aristotelian way of looking at the way knowledge advances and the way social practices and institutions advance. Or, for instance, if you're going to learn how to throw a football or how to be a quarterback in the NFL, you might want Tom Brady as your coach because instead of reading a book on how to be a master quarterback, because the experience of mastering the practice of quarterbacking in the NFL is one of the gives insight to how that role is best filled. Now, it doesn't mean that Lamar Jackson isn't out there Patrick Mahomes reinventing quarterbacking, but they didn't start from scratch. They started from the people who came before them, and it's no accident that in most sports, the people who go on to be great coaches are people who played, who were students of the game before they became masters in the game. They didn't just develop their skills and their knowledge abstractly. Important to know that this is also the way that our character and our desire, remember Plato's discussion of how the reason should rule our appetites and our desires. Well, Aristotle took a much more a focus, and I think the next slide has this, focus much more on conditioning, the idea that we have to learn what to like and what to dislike, which, those are some of our major moral sort of judgments there. What's good, what's bad, what do we detest, what do we love? We have to learn these things through conditioning, through just sort of experiencing them in our day-to-day lives and in our education and in our development. An important thing also with in contrast to Plato is that Aristotle was much more willing to consider the good as contextual, and there to be different types of practices, different types of traditions, different types of communities, and different types of government, and what is good in those contexts might be different. And that's an important one to hold on to for the last slide. All right, so a few key concepts, right? One of the guiding concepts that we associate with Aristotle is this idea of teleology, the idea that everything has a purpose. Even the purpose of a stone when you drop it is to move to the earth, and that's why it does so. The purpose of an acorn is to grow up into an oak tree, and so an excellent oak, an excellent acorn, is one that sprouts and grows into the tallest, broadest, sturdiest tree with the most leaves, or something like that. And so the conditions that lead to that excellence are plenty of water and sunshine and good soil. And so you can see it's the same with humans, right? There's an excellence to being a human, and what is a good and just world is the environment that develops and allows and encourages those people to develop into their best possibility. And what is that for humans? While Plato was certainly concerned with human nature, Aristotle really takes it up to a next level. Human nature is a major concept for us going forward, and in political theory in general. Aristotle asserts that we're political animals in the sense that our excellence is only developed as we develop our moral capacity through participation in a community, and specifically in politics, at the highest form, philosophizing with each other, like Socrates and like Aristotle and Plato were out there doing, but also more practically in terms of debate and self-rule, in terms of the people who participate in the polity as citizens, saying, what type of community are we? How can we live out our values? What kinds of policies, laws, rights should we have? What's the best way to live? How should we conduct our affairs? That in the process of doing that, we develop our linguistic and our intellectual skills, our rational skills, and we develop our sense of who deserves what and what is right and wrong, right? And that this idea of who deserves what is central for Aristotle. Specifically here, we have this idea that the good life is the virtuous life, and the most important virtue is justice, and justice is defined in a very basic term here for Aristotle: treating likes alike, give to each person what they deserve, and this is the way that we guide our relationships with friends, families, citizens, and non-citizens, including slaves, which is something that we'll get to in a minute. But for Aristotle, you want to treat people with the honor that they deserve, give them the rewards and the respect that they deserve, based on how noble their character is. And the nobility of their character has to do with a little bit like with Plato, how well they serve their community, right? Which is for Aristotle more context specific. But how good a member of the community you are has to do with with your courage, your service, your loyalty, all of these kinds of virtues, but mostly justice ends up being the central virtue. And you can see it means, right, in a sense of citizenship, it means treating equal citizens equally, and treating non-citizens, treating lessers lesser, right? Or, and maybe if you live in a monarchy, it involves a certain amount of respect for the monarch, right? So that might be context specific, which is both interesting, but also opens up problems again, right? Treat lesser people as lesser is just as important, and treat your betters as better than you is just as important as treat people who are equal equally, right? So Aristotle is not all about this idea of we're all equal, right? Constitution, Declaration, right? Go back to the Declaration, all men are created equal. Aristotle's not into that. Thinks that actually cuts against the very idea of ethics, which means differentiating. How are we going to perfect ourselves as a people if we treat the vicious, mean, selfish, greedy people as just as good as the noble, self-sacrificing, intellectually curious servants of their community, the people who lead and help and give and serve? Well, we should treat them as better. And if we don't acknowledge them as better people, how will we as a community be able to pass on those values, condition the next generation to love virtue, unless we show them that we honor, right? Honor, Aristotelian virtue ethics are very honorific. He loves things like awards and titles and such that shows who are the best among us, in order to serve as an example for what we should love. And also, right, the opposite of that would be punishments to show what we should hate. And so, when we send people to prison, one of the reasons we might be doing that is because we're showing what we as a society despise in order to serve as an example to the community and to the next generation. And specifically, we often associate Aristotle with this idea. Sorry, we got some bells going. It's noon. Of finding the golden mean, right, which avoids excess. And so, what does that mean? We often talk about courage, right? So, the soldier, which this is a specific practice. I don't have practice on this one, right? But it's a practice of being a military soldier, and you want to show a certain respect for authority, your betters, your superiors. You also want to embody certain virtues like bravery. But for Aristotle, bravery is not simply like, charge out into the fire of the enemy. It's when you are called for, when it is appropriate, when it is needed by your community to show enough determination to overcome fear, but not to ignore fear completely, not to be excessively rash and say, I don't care about danger, right? So you respect danger, but you're not excessively afraid of it. You're also not excessively not afraid of it. You show this golden mean. And so similarly, when we have an interaction with someone, if they are a a noble, just, smart, loyal, courageous person, we treat them with a certain amount of respect, not more than they deserve, not less than they deserve. And if they are our equal in all of those virtues, we treat them as an equal. But if they're not, we don't treat them as an equal, right? That is essential to this idea of the means of justice. All right. And so one of the big takeaways, one of the reasons why political scientists love Aristotle is that he talks, instead of simply this one type of government that degrades and degrades and degrades, all the way from aristocracy down to tyranny, Aristotle has this sort of different typology that concerns ideal and distorted or perverted or degenerate types of regimes. And the key here is the number of rulers, right? So one ruler ideally gives you monarchy. And as Hobbes will tell us, like, this is the best, right? This is ideal. If you had one absolutely morally pure ruler who could make all the decisions, this would give you the ideal society. A little bit worse, but still pretty good, would be a few rulers who, if you have a few super smart rulers, you have an aristocracy, the rule by the best, and that's pretty good. If you have many, right, if you have what we might call a democracy or republic, you have ideally for Aristotle what we call a polity. And as I'll mention here in a second, that's not just rule by the masses. That's rule by constitution, rule by law, which are determined by the people. And yet it's a little bit differently, right? So he would say that this is sort of the least good of the ideal forms, but he'd say it's also the most stable. Because remember our example of Gladiator, right? Where Marcus Aurelius dies and Commodus becomes the king, the emperor, and we move from the great, best philosophical king, emperor, to the tyrant who's greedy and vicious and only in it for themselves. And so Aristotle acknowledged that, these forms, aristocracy becomes oligarchy very quickly. Monarchy becomes tyranny very quickly. Much more slowly, polity becomes democracy, the rule of the mob, the kind of thing that Plato was talking about in Book 8. But he thinks that this, or maybe we could say even with a certain type of representative democracy that we have today, you could even skirt this line here between polity and aristocracy and have rule by law, rule by constitution, and rule by the most noble amongst the polity, amongst the voting public. And so Aristotle we find quite useful in that sense. One thing that's important to I think an interesting way to think about the perversion of the ideal versus the distorted is that the monarch rules by one, but he rules for the people. The aristocrats rule by a few, but they rule for the people. The polity rules by the many, but they rule for the people. In a tyranny, the king is just, the tyrant is just in it for his or herself. It's ruled by the one for the one. Oligarchy is rule by the rich for the rich. Democracy is rule, of the masses for themselves, which means every person trying to get an advantage over every other person. And so you have mob rule, majority rule, but not for rule of the community as a whole, right? If we can take advantage of the minority, we will in a democracy. A constitutional republic, by contrast, will have rules and norms and traditions that ensure that we rule for the whole community. And so I have some of that down here. And one of the things that's interesting is, right, the idea of the wisdom of the masses comes out, that Aristotle says, well, in a good polity, the people exercise a certain amount of wisdom, and it's sort of like that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, that nobody really remembers anymore. But the best cheat, the best sort of like if you don't know the answer to a question and you need some help, there were a bunch of ones. One was phone a friend. That was never as good as poll the audience, because when you poll the audience, a bunch of people may not know, but by and large, the answer that got the most votes would be the best answer. It would be the right answer, because some people in that group of 100 people would know the answer, and so everyone else who didn't know would cancel each other out, and you'd be left with some real knowledge. And this is actually how a lot of democratic theory works. And Aristotle was in on that. So, a democracy like the one we have today, a republic, a constitutional republic, is one that Aristotle was pretty down with, right? So he was an okay Democrat in that sense, and he was a major proponent of the rule of law and constitutionalism. And so in that way, maybe he looks kind of good next to Plato, and gives us an interesting starting place for contemporary thought. But the dark side of Aristotle is that his obsession with teleology, and teleology that's found through, especially in the social world, looking at traditions of knowledge and traditions of belief, is that it not only incorporated a lot of social bias, but it would naturalize that social bias. And that, I think, is an essential point here. Aristotle was not talking about race in the way that we do today. Race did not exist as a concept in that same way. It's in a sense a modern invention, our conceptions of race today. But he did believe that there were peoples that he called barbarians who were natural slaves, because they were naturally unfit for self-governance, and therefore the best life for them was to be ruled by a superior people. And this idea of natural slaves and naturalizing difference, the idea of looking at social differences that you observe in the world and translating them into some natural, biological, teleological, essential difference, is a really, really damning legacy that comes out of Aristotle. And we see it also in terms of gender and sexuality. In terms of gender, Aristotle talked about the proper roles of men and women. But followers of Aristotle for centuries, for generations, including the Catholic Church, which under Aquinas, who I'll talk about in the next video, gets really into this idea of Christian Catholic teleology, start talking about sex and gender roles as natural, and specifically things like same-sex relationships as unnatural, as against nature, and as abominations. That kind of talk has a long legacy of being used to naturalize discrimination. And so that is the dark side of Aristotle. But one thing that I think is worth noting, and sorry, this 25 minutes, what are you going to do? Aristotle is important. There is a line in Aristotle that I have always been fascinated, where, to paraphrase it, and I don't know why I didn't get the quote out here, but Aristotle says, well, he's talking about how only only very few people can engage in philosophy, and only a select part of the overall polity can be citizens who participate in the debate and the discourse and the politics of the day, discussing, the nature of the community and its goals and its policies and things like that, all its values. And a lot of the other people have to, be shoveling the shit, right? They got to be out in the fields. They got to be mucking out the horse stalls. They have to be doing the cooking and the cleaning and all of that. And, Aristotle sort of, has the part of him who says, well, you got people who are naturally inferior and should be put into that kind of work, and people who are naturally superior and should be citizens. But he also has this sort of contextual element where he's like, well, listen, what's fit for citizenship versus what's fit for servitude, maybe it's different based on the needs of the polity. And specifically, he kind of just thinks, well, if machines, and he actually uses these terms, although the translation is, is interesting, what we think of machines in the modern sense. But if machines did all the work, then maybe everyone could participate in politics. But it ain't that way, is sort of what Aristotle said. People have to do the work that doesn't involve developing their minds and developing their rhetorical and their intellectual and their moral capacities. And oh well, those people, the people who are most fit for that work should do that work, and the people who are most fit for the brainy, ruling, philosophizing work should do that work. But what if we lived in a context where the machines really did do all the work, and where everyone could, consistent with society getting its work done, be educated, spend time thinking about the good life, discussing what's right and wrong, discussing what kinds of policies and politics we should have? Maybe we wouldn't need not simply slavery, but maybe we wouldn't need the same kind of class servitude that we've had throughout history, that we continue to have to some extent today. Maybe there's a kind of proto-Marxism in Aristotle where, geez, if the machines do all the work, and society today, the machines do all the work in the sense that society today is massively productive. Well, maybe in those conditions, everyone can have a good liberal arts education and participate in the higher intellectual pursuits of self-governance and philosophy and debate. Maybe we can all do the work to develop ourselves as humans as fully as possible in the modern sense. And that's just, right? That's not what Aristotle's saying, but this is why interpretation of political theory and what we do with it is fun. Do we have to discard Aristotle because he explicitly said some pretty dark stuff, and because the way he set up his philosophy has lent it to uses that are pretty dark? Or can we reclaim the good parts of it and push it in a direction that maybe Aristotle never really would have, although he kind of hints towards it, never would have thought possible? Maybe we can reimagine Aristotle in a way that is not so hierarchical and conservative, but is more humane and liberatory, right? In the end, he's concerned with equality. Maybe we can reimagine that. So that's Aristotle, done with the ancients. Moving on in our next video.